Hello, everyone. This is Robert Nicholson. You are tuned in to The Deep Map, a weekly podcast from the Philos Project that explores the hidden religious and cultural dynamics driving headlines around the world. Very happy, as always, to be joined by my co-host, Dominique Hoffman.
Excited as always, Robert.
How are you, Dominique?
I'm good. How are you, Robert? You've been busy.
Very busy. It's been a very busy few weeks. A lot of traveling, a lot of Zoom calls. It's a tough work we do, but we're not digging ditches, so we should be thankful. I'm really happy to have a good friend of the Philos Project here with us today, Mary Margaret Olohan, a name that many of you will recognize from her work in journalism and her work on social media. I'm going to introduce her here in a moment. I do want to say this podcast is being recorded one day after a historic march in Washington, D.C. Roughly 300,000 good hearted Americans showed up at the National Mall to march, to stand, to speak out in favor of the people of Israel in these trying times. And that march comes on the heels of other marches, not a whole lot smaller, that have been happening around the world almost since the Hamas massacre of October 7th. We've seen them in places like Paris and London, and even here in the United States, and even in Washington, D.C., not that long ago. These marches, these so-called pro-Palestinian marches, have effectively been pro-Hamas marches. They've often been accompanied by anarchy, violence, defacement of public property, and frankly, in some cases, calls for the genocide of the Jews living in the Holy Land. Really disturbing stuff. And I was really encouraged by what we saw yesterday in Washington, D.C., just as encouraged by the participation of the Philos Project and our partner organization, Passages. We had over 700 people there, kind of spread out, holding signs, announcing Christian friendship with the Jewish people. And that meant a lot. We got a lot of notes, a lot of engagement, even on social media. Jewish Americans who were just surprised to see non-Jews out there in the streets saying, "Hey, we're with you." Something as simple as that. But it's a great opportunity to drill down a bit on what's really happening in this country on this issue. And I think Mary Margaret Olohan is a great person to talk to about it. I'd like to read her bio here very briefly and then jump right in. Mary Margaret is a senior reporter at the Daily Signal, where she covers all things culture, also some politics, and she also is very active on social media. Before the Daily Signal, she was at the Daily Wire, and she got her start at the Daily Caller, where she participated in the American Journalism Institute Fellowship. You've done all the dailies, Mary
All of
Margaret.
them.
All
I've
the
only got a
dailies.
few left.
Are there other more dailies?
Well, there's Daily Mail, which I feel like would be more down the road. And then there's the Daily Beast, but I don't know about them.
Yeah, that probably require a slight change in the
Yeah,
career path. That's
maybe a
true. There are a
little
lot of
bit.
dailies.
Yeah.
Well, you work on a lot of different issues. I love your work because it combines like great reporting, but also has this slightly guerrilla dimension to it. Not the animal, the method. Where you really go out into the streets, and when it comes to these protests, you've actually gone. You're, I think, one of the first people to really go out and see with your own eyes and take video from some of these, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas marches. And a lot of people saw what was happening in those marches because of what you did there. So I want to commend you for that. I want to hear more about what you saw and what you think is happening. But before we get into all that, I want to ask you the question I ask almost everyone, which is, how did you become who you are? What was your origin story? How did you get into journalism and why?
I like that, the origin story. I haven't had a request for that before. I'm the oldest girl in a big Irish Catholic family. I was homeschooled growing up, and I always cared a lot about culture issues, just because as a big family, a lot of these issues, especially the protection of children's innocence, touch on big families and parents' desire to uh, be aware of what their children are being taught and their faith and growing in the faith. So all these different political issues seem to touch on our family. And as I got older, I grew more and more invested in them. I went to college thinking I would be a teacher because I love to read and write. And I took one journalism class and thought, I hate this. I can't use adjectives. I have to write just straight news. This doesn't sound like fun. And, um, started working for a publishing company out of college. And while I was working there, the Kavanaugh hearings happened. And, when Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was accused of sexually assaulting someone. And I paid really close attention to those hearings and listened to both sides. And it was such a fascinating and horrible and sad time to be tuned into politics. And it suddenly made me want to be part of the news rather than be reacting to it. Because, as I was engaging with what was going on, I started realizing that there were so many media outlets that weren't telling the truth, media outlets that were willing to go with one narrative, or willing to report things from anonymous sources that weren't necessarily trustworthy. And so I kind of took a leap of faith and applied to the Daily Caller and got a reporting job there. Started covering culture for them after a couple months, and it has been quite the ride. I never expected to be covering the things that I've covered, or interviewing some of the people that I've interviewed. It's been a huge blessing, and I can only thank, as Speaker Johnson actually said to me recently, that every God places everyone where they are for a very specific reason. And he gives you the talents that you are blessed with, and you got to use them to the best of your ability. So that's where I am right now, trying to use those for his greater glory.
That's awesome. Good for
Mm.
you. I think we need young leaders and young reporters like you telling the truth. How did your career bring you to interviewing people on the street? Because I know a lot of your reporting is interviewing people at these rallies. So, what has
Yeah.
your work been covering, especially since 10/7? I know there's been a lot
Yeah.
of Palestinian rallies and Israel rallies in DC.
Yeah, I started doing man on the street interviews for the Daily Caller back in 2019. I would go to the Women's March to interview people, because I think that when you have a very, um, I would say, more radical group of people that doesn't represent the larger American population, but they're saying very radical things, it's important to go out there and ask them, you know, I'm not trying to twist your words. Tell me what you think about this, because I want to show everyone so that they can hear from you and understand what you are saying. And so for very politically divisive topics like the ones that come up at the Women's March, uh, you don't have to do much work there. You just show people what the marchers are saying, and they can decide for themselves how they feel about it. And I think the same goes for these protests in DC, specifically at George Mason University, which is right outside of DC, George Washington University, American University, all these elite American universities where these college students apparently are so comfortable basically aligning with Hamas. And so, what we've been hoping to do by going to these protests is showing people, yes, they are saying these radical things. Do you agree with them? Are we comfortable with this kind of rhetoric? Because when we don't go, people are like, oh no, like it wouldn't be that bad. Like they're probably pro Palestine, but they don't hate Israel, or they don't think that the Hamas fighters who who went and murdered and slaughtered and raped all these people, they don't think they're martyrs. Well, we have videos showing that they do, in fact, think that, and we have them in their very own words saying that. And I think it's incredibly important to be able to show people the truths of what people are saying on these topics, because um, that's video evidence, and it's on the internet forever.
Let me
Yeah.
ask just methodologically, when you're doing that, I've never done anything like that. How do you come up to the students? What do you say as far as your background? Do you tell them who you are, where you work, or is it just, um, you know, hey, you, what do you think about such and such? I'm just curious who they think they're talking to, because that, of course, could be something that people say, right? Is that, well,
Right.
you're kind of tricking people into saying things that they wouldn't otherwise say.
Right. So when I go up to someone, if usually I'll have a cameraman with me, which is preferable. At these pro Hamas protests, we've kind of been trying to go, I wouldn't say undercover, but just more under the radar because, and I can come back to this later, but they are so, so wary of media. And actually, I have a lot of interesting things to say on that point because they are very aware of how to use the media too. But when we go to these protests, we've been using our phones and getting footage that way to try and blend in with the crowd a little bit. But if I do go up to someone and ask them a question, I'll say, if we're using a camera, I'll say, hey, do you mind if we ask you some questions for a video? And if they say yes, then we have their consent and we're good to go. Now it's up to them to say, who do you work for? Or, some people will say, what's the name of your outlet? And then they'll Google us and be like, don't talk to her. She's a fascist. And, and then, that can be not fun because occasionally they'll follow you around the crowd and say, don't talk to her. She's the enemy or any
Wow.
Wow.
stuff like that. I had some protesters follow my colleague and I once. This wasn't at the pro Hamas protest. It was a more abortion related protest, but they followed us around and were screaming into a megaphone so loudly in my face that their spit got all over my face. And just, blowing whistles in our faces until we ultimately left. They ran us out of that
Wow.
protest. But at these pro Hamas ones, uh, we tried to talk to a lot of people in the daytime ones because they feel a little more daytime at these protests feels a little safer. The nighttime ones, I was explaining to some friends earlier, there's a whole other vibe at these protests than I have experienced at some of the other ones I've gone to in DC and around the country. Uh, at the political ones, it can feel dicey sometimes. Unless Antifa is there, it doesn't usually feel unsafe. But at these pro Hamas protests or anti Israel protests, there has been an element that's made me feel unsafe a couple times. Uh, when you turn around and someone whose only their eyes you can see is looking at you as if they really, really don't like you, that's a little scary, especially if you're not wearing a mask and everybody else is, to hide their face to avoid federal detection, which is what they told us. So we try and make judgment calls on whether or not to use our camera equipment and the mic or whether to just take videos with our phones, but it kind of depends on the time of day and who we're dealing with and whether they even seem open to media at all.
It's funny. We have a scholar, Rami. It's called the Rami Ayad Scholar in DC. He's Palestinian Christian. His name's Ihab Hassan. He was telling me that he was on the metro on the day of the big protest, 100,000 people, and he said, "I was scared." I'm from Ramallah.
Wow.
This is a guy who's he's been in some crowds, some unruly places, and he's seeing these people on the metro, all wearing the masks and the whole thing, and he said it freaked me out, which is
Yeah.
saying something.
That is saying something. And I think especially when there's an atmosphere of we need to hide our actions from the authorities in this country, that definitely gives you pause. uh, there was a girl at George Washington University's candlelight vigil that they held for the martyrs, as they called it, which we learned throughout the evening that they didn't just consider the Palestinians who have died to be martyrs; they considered the Hamas fighters to be martyrs. Um, there was a girl that came up to me handing out masks, and she said, "You should wear one of these, or else they'll be able to recognize you." And I said, "Who? Who's going to recognize me?" And she said, I can't remember exactly what word she used, but her indication was authorities and federal authorities. So I put it on, and my colleague did too, just because everybody was wearing them, and we thought maybe we should blend in a little bit tonight.
At these rallies, when you hear people saying these extreme things, are the people at these protests, if you want to even call it a protest, are they Arab? Are they Western students? Like, what's the demographic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It was hard to see at the first one we went to because it was nighttime. At George Mason University in Fairfax, a lot of the students were Arab, and it was interesting. There were a lot of young white males that came to the protest too, who were declining face masks, and I think they were more there along for the ride, if that makes sense. They were interested in watching and a little skeptical. And I heard a girl saying to them, "Hey, you should cover your faces so that no one knows who you are." And one of the guys in the group started laughing and was like, "No, I'm good." And the kid next to him took one and put it on and looked nervous. So that was interesting. But another dynamic that I picked up on, and this specifically I saw at George Mason and then also at the Israeli embassy when we went to a protest there, or a demonstration there, was that there will be groups of young men, specifically at George Mason. They were more muscular young men. A lot of these American college students can be kind of scrawny and they don't look very imposing. But these young men would be wearing the kefras, I believe it is, kefras, the head
Yeah.
coverings,
Mm-hmm.
kafia.
Yep.
And so they'd be wearing the head coverings. And uh, when the leader of the protest would be talking about what types of chants they were going to say, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, she would say, "We already decided what the media is going to take away from this protest. So don't defer from any chants. We're going to be the ones that decide what chants we're going to say. And we already know what message we want to come away from this protest, so leave it as it is." And so those chants would be "Free, free Palestine," "From the river to the sea, Palestine will soon be free." Some chants in Arabic that I would recognize if you said them, but I couldn't repeat them for you. And then these guys in front of us, when the one single counter protester showed up to this protest and said something along the lines of "Go Israel," these guys got very upset and they started saying "Allahu Akbar." And the protest leader did not like that at all. And multiple people in the crowd got very nervous and they shut it down quickly. And my colleague, who was standing behind these guys, overheard them muttering to each other about how the protest was lame and how it wasn't strong enough and they weren't making enough of a statement.
Mm.
And they were bothered and angry. And we observed that dynamic again at the Israeli embassy about 2 weeks ago when we went to a demonstration there. And that was a lot of American university students and a lot of adults from the area. And oh my gosh, I don't think I will ever forget that night. It was completely crowded streets full of people chanting against Israel right in front of the Israeli embassy. And I could see, the embassy is all lit up and the police are all standing guard in a huge long line around the embassy. And every once in a while, one of them would yell to the other ones to tighten the security. And, it was unforgettable. And that night I did feel a little uncomfortable too. We were so tightly packed in there. I said to my colleague, "We probably should be somewhere where something goes wrong, we can get out of here quickly because this doesn't seem smart."
When you're interviewing these people on the street, what are some of the overarching narratives that protesters, give you justifying their support for Hamas? Do you get a sense that they even understand what they're supporting, like the sheer evil of it? Is it ignorance or is it just pure, like, yes, I support these evil atrocities?
It's challenging because the specific students engaged in the protests are really hard to get to talk to you. They're so The leaders of these protests are so emphatic about not talking to media that the students themselves are very careful. There was one kid that we did get to talk to us. We're respectful. We say like we'd really like to hear what you think about this. And I saw him look back at the group to see if anyone was looking. And then when he started talking to us, three guys from the group walked by and just looked at us and then walked by again and looked at us. And I had a long day already. So I looked at this kid and I was like, "Are they trying to intimidate you not to talk to us?" And he looked really uncomfortable and he said, "I think so." So that's the level of pressure that is on them not to talk to media. Some of the most interesting interviews I've done were outside the White House with these pro ceasefire activists, and they were pro Palestine as well. And they won't tell you what they think of Hamas. They won't say the word Hamas. It is very strange.
Hmm.
They know what Hamas is, and they reveal that through the context of the conversations, but they don't want to say the word, and they won't condemn the attack, and they won't condemn Hamas. Now, I've had people say, oh, well, we don't believe in brutality, or we don't support such aggressive attacks. But, they're careful not to outright condemn the October 7th attack. And one kid even told me, what did he say? He said he understands the frustrations that led to the attack, which we have a good video of that too, where I said to him, he said, I understand the frustrations that led to the attack. And I'm trying to remember how he phrased this. He said the response shouldn't be blown out of proportion or something along those lines. And I said, okay, well, what do you think the response should be to such rape and murder and slaughter and brutality? And he said he didn't know, but that he thought that Israel should implement a ceasefire.
Well,
Hmm.
you've alluded to these protests or rallies being very well organized. Have you been able to ascertain who exactly is organizing this response to, the media? Who is saying, these chants are okay, these chants are not okay? Is it small grassroots movements, or do you suspect this is a much larger organized campaign?
Well, Students for Justice in Palestine is, I would say, one of the overarching organizations that is involved in this. And they have campus chapters all over the country, and they've organized walkouts and called for protesting. Back, I believe it was maybe like October 11th, 12th, we published a story at the Daily Signal on this toolkit that I found. Which I found by going through their Instagram stories on these individual chapters Instagram pages, because that's where all the youth are, Instagram or TikTok. And so I would go through their Instagram stories, and they'd say, come out for this rally at X time. Here's the toolkit on what you should know on these protests. And so you click the link to the Google Doc, and I downloaded it. And in that Google Doc, Students for Justice in Palestine, the overall group, aligns with Hamas. And they specifically say, we're not just in solidarity with this movement against Israel. We are part of this movement. And
Hmm.
that one line immediately jumped out at me. And so we did a whole story on this toolkit and on these sentiments and on what they were calling for, which was mass protesting across the country. And you'll notice too, I mean, maybe I'm oversensitive to this because I cover a lot of protests, but every DC protest goes off the charts to make sure that they talk about how it's going to be peaceful. They'll say this is a peaceful demonstration. Don't bring X, Y, or Z, or make sure that you don't do X, Y, or Z. We want this to be a peaceful demonstration. A lot of these pro-Palestine protests, their flyers and posts and things like that, they don't make any mention of peace or peaceful demonstration. They'll talk about being heard, and they'll say maybe don't bring weapons or things like that. I've seen that a couple times. But there's not the same kind of desperation for a peaceful protest to take place. So, interestingly enough, in Florida, Governor DeSantis and his I think there's some special name for it, but it's a special group of university presidents that are in this little league together and decide things for the state's universities. And Governor DeSantis's administration noticed this line from the SJP toolkit as well, and they used that to tell a bunch of universities that their chapters of SJP students had to be disbanded because of the anti-Semitic rhetoric that they were promulgating and for aligning with a terrorist organization. So I think it's the University of Florida and two others that have to get rid of their SJP chapters because of this. So that was kind of how I got wind of a lot of this in the first place, because I was just so blown away that these students would align with Hamas like that.
Mary Margaret, what do you think about these marches and what they say about the United States in this moment? It's a big question. We've talked about it a little bit here and there in previous episodes, but it does seem like there are things, taking place beneath the surface that the events of October 7th have brought to the surface, right? And we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
these movements, which no doubt are being coordinated by a group or some coalition of groups, but also to some extent feel somewhat organic. It doesn't take much to get 100,000 people in the streets, whereas the march yesterday, which we'll talk about here in a moment, the pro-Israel march, there were a ton of different groups coming together, resources deployed. It took a lot of work to get, you know 300,000 people on the National Mall.
Right.
I'm just wondering if you have any kind of working theories, because you're covering culture, right? This is what you do. You're seeing snapshots of culture on other fronts, right? Related to life and marriage, et cetera. When you look at these protests, when you walk among these people, what do you think? What does it say to you? What do you think is happening? I mean, the different groups that are coming together, the progressives, the kind of the Islamists. Yeah. Any kind of even rough analysis about these protests and what they mean for America today?
Well, it scares me, Robert. Just being at the on these college campuses and hearing this kind of rhetoric from college students. I'm from a big family, so I have siblings that are their age, and I know that young people. I would ideally like to consider myself still a young person, but I know that young people can be naive and have quickly formed opinions, especially on political events. But I do think it very strongly speaks to the state of American academia, where you go to a classroom for this class that you or your parents are paying so much money for, and these professors indoctrinate you with ideology on subject matter that's incredibly sensitive, and its historical and religious roots go far beyond what you're being told or what's being explained to you. And not only that, but the TikTok element that plays into all of this, I think we very much underestimate. One girl I spoke with mentioned seeing on TikTok horrible stories about the babies that had
Mm,
been slaughtered in Israel, and she thought that they had been slaughtered in Gaza. uh, that's the level of misinformation in her head. She was thinking those evil, evil, evil Israelis who would do such a horrible thing to these babies. And when I told her, I said, no, actually that happened in Israel and Hamas did it. And I pointed at the protest next to us and I said, and they are expressing sentiments aligning with Hamas. And she looked from me to the protest and then at me, and her jaw dropped. And then her friend
mm,
said, I don't know. I don't think that that's what they're
wow.
saying. So it scares me a lot. And obviously, like, you can go one by one and explain things to people. But when you see that many people who are willingly believing lies, such as the fake news about the hospital in Gaza, where we know now that Hamas accidentally bombed the hospital, or near the hospital, right? I don't think they actually bombed the hospital. We know that now. But even after that information came out, I was at protests in Washington where the streets were filled and prominent politicians were saying, how dare Israel bomb that hospital, when they knew what was
Mm,
going on. So, and we've seen this before. We always see misinformation or disinformation being spread. It's just part of politics now in the age of the internet. But when you see it weaponized like this to encourage movements, and to stand aside what we know to be so evil, uh, that scares me a lot. And it's so different than other elements of these protests that I cover, because uh, it, I don't know, there's an evil element to it that you just can sense. And obviously there are a lot of the issues I cover have a religious component to them. For example, abortion. People who think that abortion is the murder of a human child absolutely believe that there is a religious element to that fight. But this, I think, is more tangible for a lot of people. Hamas, we have videos of them slaughtering people, um, in real time, the Facebook live streamings of grandmothers to their daughters. I spoke to a girl yesterday who said her friend had to watch her grandma be killed on live stream, and her grandmother has been kidnapped by Hamas, and her grandfather was slaughtered by them. So to have access to the truth, but to willingly believe what is false, is an egregious violation of human ethics or human code of conduct. But then to be the ones that are purposefully spreading the false information to confuse other people, that is not something I would want to answer for.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Wow.
Do you get
Let
the
me
sense? Oh, go ahead, Robert.
let me just ask one follow up there, and it relates to the march that happened yesterday. So you were there, I believe, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
just curious what you saw. Any anecdotes you may have from that experience? How does it compare, contrast with what you've seen at these marches, and what did it tell you about that side of America and where it's at today?
Well, first of all, it was such a massive protest that I couldn't even post anything. There was no service. There was so many people there that I think I had to wait until like 5 o'clock to post things, which for me as a reporter is frustrating. But at the same time, that is a lot of people in the nation's capital. I think organizers told me last night that there was an estimated 290,000 people in the streets, and then another, I think, 190,000 more on virtual platforms watching. I think that second number might be bigger. Um,
I heard
but
250 for that second number, but could
250,
even
you're
might be
probably
bigger than
right.
that even. Yeah.
I would believe it. And just the joy in this protest, I was surprised. I think I was thinking it would be a little more sad, and I don't want to imply that people weren't respectful or very cognizant of what they're fighting against and standing against. But I was pleasantly surprised by how joyful this march was. And in a way, it reminded me of the joy and fervor at the March for Life, which I've been to many times, where um, this is a very joy filled and youth filled protest. Actually, rally. A woman I spoke to, I said, "So, what do you think of this protest?" And she said, "It's not a protest; it's a rally." So I need to watch my language here. But it's just, it was very, I would say, invigorating to be there and to see so many young people. We don't interview kids because you have to have their parents' consent, and if they're not there, then you can't do it. But so many cute kids in groups together, everyone in blue and white. I got one video of all these guys dancing together. And as they were dancing, more and more people joined their circle. It was charming. And so many families, husbands and wives, so many rabbis, very little counter protesters, actually, which, we're always looking to see if there's counter protesters. And unfortunately, it's an important part of what we do is capturing that. And very few. There was a group of rabbis that were calling for a ceasefire that were on the side of the road, and they were kind of stirring up some trouble. But other than that, I really didn't see any kind of negative interactions. The entire National Mall, from the African American Museum of History to almost all the way to the Capitol, was filled with people. And yeah, like I said, there were so many people there that we couldn't even post things. And it was everyone I spoke to, I would say, "Why are you here?" They would say, "To stand with Israel, to show people that this many people care about Israel, to call for the release of the hostages." Those were the priorities that I was hearing. And I was particularly impressed, as someone who is serious about my Catholic faith, to hear how many people spoke to me about prayer yesterday, because that's not something you hear a lot about in DC. It's the
Mm.
power of prayer and the importance of prayer. And just everyone I spoke to was so devout, so reliant that God would protect them and would protect Israel and would, take care of their family members. The girl who I spoke with, I'm trying to remember her name. Let me pull it up on my phone because she was so amazing. Her name was, I think, Anya. It was Anat. I think I'm saying that right.
Not.
Anat,
Mm-hmm.
Anat Shoshani. Her grandmother was captured by Hamas. And she told me, I don't have time to cry. I don't have time to be afraid. I have to fight. And I said, how do you fight? And she said, I'd pray all day. I'm praying every day, all day for my grandma's safe release. And I was so impressed by that. She didn't even tear up while she was talking to me. She was so convicted and just so firm. I was so impressed. So that was my overall experience, was just people who were so trusting in God and reliant that God will take care of them. And yeah, I I'm running around trying to be a reporter, do my reporter thing. I wish I could have stood still and just kind of taken it in. There was one moment when my cameraman Tim was fixing his rig, and I had time to stand still and look around. And one of the speakers called out to the crowd, to everyone, to hold up the images of the hostages and have a moment of prayer. And so everyone held up their images of the hostages, and I had such chills watching all these people hold up these pictures of the hostages and have a moment of silence for them. It was incredible.
Incredible.
Our Fearless Action League was there with a lot of our staff. Were you able to interview Jews and ask them how it felt to have Christians standing in solidarity with them? How was that reception? Because I know it was a
I
majority
Yeah.
Jewish population there.
I was a little bit. They said they were so overjoyed to have that many people there standing in solidarity with them. I actually asked a bunch of people if they were surprised by the turnout too.
Mm.
And one woman, she was elderly, maybe in her 70s. She was Jewish, and she told me she was delighted to see people of different faiths there. She said that she was really surprised by how big the turnout was, and that she thought there were going to be more people coming too. Another girl told me this is just the beginning.
Wow,
I didn't get to ask her if she meant this is just the beginning of the march or if this is just the beginning of a greater movement, but I'm guessing she probably meant both.
that's amazing. Were you able to get a sense for how bipartisan this was? I did hear that there was a lot of Democrats and Republicans who came together, which is very rare in our polarized culture. So, what did that feel like on the ground for you as a
Oh,
reporter?
yeah. So rare, right? I mean DC is so divided,
Mhm.
and most of the issues that I cover, there is no middle ground. There is no attempt at a middle ground. um, I won't get into the semantics of it, but there is, people believe that one side is very, very right and the other side is very, very wrong. And Republicans and Democrats do not cross those lines.
Mhm.
Yesterday was really interesting because Chuck Schumer spoke. He's a Democrat. I think a lot of people would say he's very far left. Mike Johnson, who's very far on the right, our new Speaker of the House, also spoke. I believe I heard Joni Ernst speaking. Could be wrong. Sounded like her. She's a Republican. I saw John Fetterman in the crowd, who I don't know. Uh, he might be a niche DC interest, but in DC, he's everybody knows who he is. He's very tall. He always wears the wrong clothing in the Senate, and he dresses very casually, and he always has kind of seemingly strange things to say. So a lot of on the right don't really like him because they yeah, they're not fans of him. But John Fetterman showed up yesterday, and I saw all kinds of conservatives and Republicans praising him on Twitter for, I believe he was wrapped in an Israeli flag and attending the March for Israel. It's probably the best dressed he's been in a long time.
He's been like really great on the issue, and
Yeah,
very like aggressively um great about it, like no holds barred. People, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the videos, people kind of accosting him in the streets, and he's like, look, what, release the hostages and
right.
this will all be over. I don't think anybody really expected that from John
I
Fetterman.
didn't. I've been very impressed. I saw him. I was leaving Sweet Green the other night on Capitol Hill. It was kind of dark, and I saw this very, very tall man in front of me. And first of all, I was kind of scared because it was dark and it was this very big man. And then I thought, oh my gosh, that's John Fetterman. And I was actually going to ask him about Israel because it was before I had heard him expressing such strong support, and I was curious. But someone was fangirling over him, so I let him enjoy his evening, and I went on my way.
Well, I know Hillary Clinton also wrote in the Atlantic an article on why a ceasefire is not the option. And I was like, that's the first and only time I'll probably ever agree with Hillary Clinton. But it's been amazing seeing
Yeah,
this issue become something that people on both sides of the aisle can agree and support.
She also went on The View, and I think it was like a 10-minute long clip of Hillary explaining the situation. And people were raving about it. They were like, we would never expect that Hillary Clinton would have such a clear understanding of these events and explain it in
Mhm.
such a logical way.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question about media, since you are the expert or a expert. You mentioned earlier the reticence of some people in the anti-Israel marches to be on camera, but also like a keen understanding of the messages they want to be out in the media. I'm sure on social media, certainly on TikTok, the algorithms are stacked on that side of things. But my general sense is that by and large, the anti-Israel side is just much more savvy when it comes to the use of media to get these messages out, seemingly unafraid to just put out half truths or blatant untruths,
Mm-hmm.
but always just seemingly very skilled. Now, maybe that's just me seeing things from afar, but I'm wondering, when you think about the media landscape, right? This is largely where you're operating in, you know, the anti-Israel side versus the pro-Israel side, the ways the two are using media, the engagement the two sides are getting. As a professional journalist, when you look at that, what kind of evaluation are you making of these two sides and their, their ability to get their messages out to the mainstream audience?
I think that's a really interesting question because typically, I think you're right, Robert, about how well, when it comes to hot topic issues, it does seem that those who are more progressive, or, that word doesn't really make sense because progressive means different things than we actually use the word for now. But those who are more far left or radical on certain issues like this one do seem to have more media tips and tools at their disposal. I'm not totally sure that that is the case here. I think that what is going on is initially with the October 7th attack, that brutality was so evident. We had so much evidence of it that the media had to just say, okay, this is obviously so wrong. This is so terrible. We will report it as it is. Then, as time has passed, there's been a little bit of time for people to forget the horrors of that day, though we should not. But there has been more time for people to see the reports coming out of Gaza and a lot of the lies being spread by Hamas, and the media is just so ready to jump on that kind of thing. And we saw this with that hospital story, as we were talking about earlier. I have all the news apps on my phone because they'll do what we call a push. So when a news outlet writes something that they think is really worth pushing, they'll send a notification to your lock screen, and that means that when you click on it, they'll get that click, and for however many thousands of people click that push, that story gets way more clicks. So it's much more profitable for them. So I got all those pushes, breaking news from Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, about this Gaza story where allegedly Israel bombed this hospital. Well, we know now that that wasn't true. But they said according to Hamas. And so all my all my colleagues and my reporter friends are all messaging each other, and we're like, did the New York Times really just say that according to Hamas, Israel bombed a hospital? But that's actually what happened there. And so I think the mainstream media wants so much to be fair here, but they forget that they're actually dealing with terrorists. And so that has been a huge issue, and they had to learn their lesson and retract and fix. But you'll see too with the way they phrase certain headlines. For example, when a pro-Palestine protester hit a man in the head, I believe with a megaphone, and that man died, everybody framed their stories along the lines of uh, pro-Israel protester dies after protest or something like that, to obviously hide the fact that this was not just a man dying; it was directly related to being hit in the head by a pro-Palestine protester. So we've seen a lot of that. I think perhaps maybe the most uh, related, egregious media related stories that I have seen and I'm sure you guys have seen this too, were the reports that some of these photographers were out over in the Middle East, were embedded with Hamas. There was a video of one photographer, I believe, holding a hand grenade while he's running along with Hamas militants to take photos. And these are photographers that are out there in, I believe, Gaza. And CNN issued a statement saying they had cut ties with one of their photographers who was implicated in this. But that is so wildly insane. And I should explain for people who might not understand, when I write a story and we're about to go to publication, typically I or my editor will go on Getty Images and we will find a photo that fits with the story. If you work for a really big publication, it's probably picked by one of your editors and you never get to choose it yourself. But I work for a smaller one, so I can usually pick it myself. So you go through Getty Images, you type the keywords, and you decide which picture best reflects what's going on in your story. So I've been spending a lot of time looking at those photos on there. And my colleagues and I have been really frustrated because there are so many photos of the devastation in Gaza, but it's kind of hard to find photos of what's gone on in Israel.
Mm.
Um, and there's even a lot of photos of Hamas, but not necessarily what they have done in Israel. And if you look at the photo captions on these photos, and I've noticed this for years, I've complained about it for years because it usually is how it goes. They will be phrased in a way that is very, very, very neutral, which obviously the media shouldn't be taking aside, but we can call terrorists terrorists. That's okay. And we can talk about what they did. You know, if you're going to talk about Israel launching a war on Gaza, you should probably mention why. If you're going to include that, if you're going to include how many people have been killed in Gaza, you should probably mention why the war started and how many people have been killed in Israel. Those are the kind of tactics that people take when they are trying to hide something from you. And I have seen that a lot.
Mm.
Mary Margaret, I want to touch on another narrative in the media that's emerged that characterizes Christian support for Israel as radical or tries to write it off as, some far right interpretation of the Bible with eschatological aims of ushering in the end times. You kind of see that
Mm-hmm.
narrative um, throughout secular media, but I've also seen many prominent leaders within the Christian community echoing these sentiments. What would your response to this narrative be? I know you've interacted with a lot of Christians at these rallies. What are their reasons for supporting Israel, and what would you want your Catholic community to know?
Yeah, I think this is just a classic example of how people try and use religion to pigeonhole and to cast Christians or Jews or Catholics as extremists, and to distract from what's actually going on. You know, I remember when Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the court. It was a whole news cycle that she was Catholic. That was the issue. It wasn't the issue was that she was a Catholic and she actually believed what Catholicism teaches. And they even went so far as to suggest that she adopted two of her children who are Black because she is an extremist Catholic racist. So that's how the media often uses religion, and media is incredibly religiously illiterate. They will use it for their own aims. They'll use words like devout or extreme depending on the candidate or the politician or the justice that they prefer. So that, I think, is important context to always remember. But um, in terms of this dialogue, I think it's an attempt to distract from what's actually going on. There is nothing evil at all about Christians supporting Israel, especially when it is coming from a loving place and a desire to protect friends and family. And Christians, the Christians that I've spoken to, like Speaker Mike Johnson, I asked him about this too. I said, I've seen people trying to say that your support for Israel is somehow extreme and somehow connected to uh, biblical end of time prophecies that make you unfit to be Speaker of the House. And he said, yes, my faith teaches that I should support Israel. Um, but it's also good pragmatic policy. So good for me that my faith lines up with pragmatic policy. And he and others have said, what's wrong with following the teachings of your faith? Like since when has that been an issue? If your faith tells you to stand with Israel because God loves Israel and God also loves Christians, what's wrong with that? And I think that, I'll get into the nuances of it sometimes, but when I'm talking to uh, people who are trying to tell me that there's something wrong with Christians supporting Israel, uh, that's what I keep coming back to is this attempt to distract from the situation at hand, because there is nothing there is nothing wrong with Christians supporting Israel, and to paint it as extremist is just so outlandish.
Hmm. What do you think that tells us about our culture? I know we've talked about it throughout this podcast, but um, I know that Mike Johnson as well, even within the Republican Party, has been characterized as radical for being so outspoken about his faith. What does this even say about the Republican Party and where we are? And have they lost that moral compass?
Oh yeah. Well, I think the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have lost their moral compass a long time ago. um, I do think that it shows us that many people nowadays are not living a faith, not practicing a faith, not believing a faith. And so when you encounter people who actually believe the tenets of their faith and actually practice the tenets of their faith, that scares other people. And it is easier to paint that as extremist than to accept that maybe you should be living that way too. And I think we see a lot of that nowadays. You know, I I'm from a big family and I love scaring people with my big family. They're like, "You have 10 siblings?" And you can see in their eyes, they're like, "Oh my gosh, my world order is completely shaken up. I don't know what to do with this." And I like to say, yeah, I am, and I'm normal, and my siblings are normal, and you would like them, and you would probably want to spend time with them, and that's, we live our faith, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I I think that it is such a good witness to our world when people are outspoken about practicing their faith and believing their faith. But Christ promised, right, that we would always face persecution for doing that. So it's no surprise to me when people do face persecution for speaking or living their faith. And that is very much evident in how our our friends in Israel have been treated as of late.
Speaking of Israel, Mary Margaret, I'd love for you to reflect a bit on the trip that we all went on back, seems like a long time ago. I guess that was what, February or March, through our Philos Catholic program. So it was you, me, Andrew Doran, who's been on this
Mm-hmm.
podcast, who runs Philos Catholic, senior research fellow here at Philos, and a number of other just fun and interesting people from a lot of different walks of life, different ages, different
Yeah.
professional backgrounds. And I mean, it was an amazing trip. I lead a lot of trips. This one was, I think, especially great. But wondering, especially in light of what we're now seeing, things that you look back on from that trip that stood out to you, that seem especially important, and what do you think? Just staying, with you and your own background as a Catholic conservative, what do you think could be transferable from the Israeli context to conservative Christian communities in America?
Well, I think it was providential that Philos invited me on that trip and that I was able to go because um I've been doing so much coverage of what's going on now. I'm not sure that I would be doing this coverage if I hadn't gone on that trip because it gave me a different level of understanding and knowledge and awareness of Israel that I did not have before at all. In fact, I knew so little about Israel before the trip that I think I told Robert multiple times, "I'm so sorry if I'm not talking. It's because I don't know anything."
You did say that.
and and Robert was so nice. He was like, "No, you do. Just say what you want to say." But it was an amazing trip for so many reasons. First of all, Israel is so beautiful, and particularly Galilee. I had no words for how absolutely stunning the land of Israel is. But also to be able to go to all these holy sites that mean so much to me. That was amazing to be able to go to mass in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Calvary, to be just steps away from this beautiful tabernacle. I went with Margaret Fernandez, and I think that was a moment that we will both carry with us forever. Just absolutely beautiful. Um, but that knowledge that I learned from that trip, being able to meet your friend, Naveen Robert, I believe her name is,
Mm-hmm.
and to experience that evening we had with her in her home, and to learn about the IDF and what these young people are doing. Just so much knowledge, and I'm so grateful to have all this insight, to be able to share the Shabbat meal with the family that we did, and to speak with this young man who told me that he was in the IDF. He was my brother's age,
Hmm.
and I was trying to imagine my little brother being on the front lines of a combat like this. I've been praying for him and other young people that we saw or met that might now be on the front lines. Yesterday, spoke with many people who told me that they had friends who were serving in the IDF, and yeah, I have thought of that many times, Robert. How that trip was so recent, and we had no idea what would be happening so soon. I think, yeah, no, I'm very grateful to have been on that trip, and uh, I think I will be benefiting from it for many months to come, just from this fallout and what we are now seeing, and being able to go to these protests and talk to people about what's going on, because I think we don't realize oftentimes how little Americans understand about that situation.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't many months ago that I had no idea what "from the river to the sea, Palestine will soon be free" even meant. And that probably sounds very naive, but it's a mouthful, and it's a cultural landscape that most people don't know about. And most people, frankly, probably don't care that much about until recent weeks. Um, and it's just the media landscape has completely changed over the past month, and the cultural landscape has changed, and I think our understanding of this entire situation has changed. And I'm grateful to have this background of this Philos Catholic trip to wade in.
Yeah, it's often it's a very common experience for me to be engaged in conversation with somebody who is coming at this conflict from a different point of view. And a few minutes into the conversation, I realize that they are starting from a wholly false premise, and it comes in different sizes and shapes, right? Just big, giant pieces of information that they do not know and are basing an entire worldview around, or an entire perspective on the conflict. And
Right.
it's almost like that moment in sitcoms where two people are talking about something and they think they know what they're talking about, but they're both talking about something totally different. And
Right.
they're like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Oh, what are you talking about? That's the experience I have,
Yeah.
and it's like, whoa, you don't even the most basic information people don't know. And what I tell myself in that moment is, well, why should they? I don't know
Right.
about conflicts in Africa or other parts of Asia. Why should I? So there is a real, I think, difficult learning curve that it's hard to make up for on TikTok or Instagram. And I find myself in a position trying to give grace as much as I can to people who just they don't do this for a living,
Right.
but also making sure that trying to give them just even the basic information so they can have an intelligent opinion. It's very hard to do. Very hard to do.
And I'm sure it must be so hard, and I'm grateful for all of you and Philos's efforts to spread awareness on this, because it's so needed. And like I was saying before, with the problem with academia now and all this progressive indoctrination that we've seen on this specific topic, it's more needed than ever. So kudos to Philos.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to have you as a friend, have you in the network. I do want to just commend you again, as I did at the beginning, for your coverage, but also the way that you do this coverage. I mean, not a lot of people would be brave enough or crazy enough, I don't know, to go out, in the middle of the night in front of the Israeli embassy, packed in like sardines with a bunch of anti-Israel protesters. Like, there's a real bravery about your work, Mary Margaret, that I think is a good model for the rest of us. Many of whom are, they don't want to say something even in a small group of friends. So good for you. Really appreciate the work
Thank
that you
you
do.
so much. Thank you.
And Dominique, any closing thoughts that you'd like to bring up here?
No, just thank you for your honest reporting. And it's just encouraging to see young reporters reporting the truth because I think we need more of that.
Thank you
Amen.
so much. We're trying. We're trying.
You're doing
Send him
great.
my way if you know of anyone.
You're doing
We
great.
will. And for all of you listening out there, I want to thank you for listening, ask you to please subscribe and share the word about the Deep Map. We have, as you can see, very interesting people doing interesting things, really getting at the heart of what's happening in the world today. We are always interested in feedback. I'll give you my email address, robert@philosproject.org. Questions, comments, anytime. I love to read them. And on our side, we will continue to bring you all of those interesting people and do our best to keep up with world events. So thanks for listening.
And Mary Margaret, where can our audience find you?
You can find my reporting at thedailysignal.com, or you can follow me on Twitter, Mary Marg Olohan. That's where I post a lot of real-time protest footage and all my stories. So it's a good place to see what I've got going on.
Thanks, Mary Margaret.
Thank you.